It's been a particularly exciting week across agriculture. From contract negotiations going on at John Deere, to Bayer appearing in the courtroom, to anti-agricultural activist Vandana Shiva appearing for a speaking engagement on a US campus. We're going to dive into all of that stuff in just one moment. Welcome to this episode of New Ground, AGDAILY's regular video series that explores everything that's interesting going on in the world of agriculture. My name is Ryan Tips, I'm the managing editor for AGDAILY, and we hope that you like, share, subscribe, do whatever you need to do on whatever platform you're watching this video on to keep seeing these videos. They're a great way to stay up to date on all of the most current happenings in our farming sector. First off, let me tell you, California juries have been hostile to Bayer in recent years, as the number of lawsuits related to the glyphosate-based weed killer Roundup have just continued to mount. The first three cases that made it into the courtroom resulted in losses for Bayer, but this week, a Los Angeles jury finally sided with science, even if this was one of the more heartbreaking situations we've seen so far. The case centered on Ezra Clark, who developed a form of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma that is more common in children, even though it's relatively rare in the Western world in general. The Clark family said that they used Roundup around their home, but jurors decided that it wasn't in a quantity sufficient enough to cause disease. Roundup is the most common weed killer in the world, and nearly every single scientific body has affirmed the safety of its active ingredient glyphosate. With this being Bayer's first courtroom win in the span of all of these lawsuits, we'll have to see how it impacts the many thousands of lawsuits moving forward. Last week, negotiations between John Deere and its workers came down to the wire, and at the time, a strike was averted, at least for now. At the beginning of negotiations over workers' 6-year contract, Deere was reportedly considering cuts to employee pay and healthcare benefits once the September 30th contract expired. The employees, on the other hand, sought better wages and retirement benefits, as well as lower cost healthcare. A tentative agreement was reached minutes after midnight Friday morning, and the current contract got a 2-week extension while the tentative agreement gets reviewed and possibly approved. The bulk of this agreement is going to affect more than 10,000 workers across 3 states, Iowa, Illinois, and Kansas. We'll see what happens in the coming weeks. The monthly Ag Economy Barometer dropped 14 points in September, settling at a reading of 124. This shows that producers are feeling less optimistic about both their current conditions on their farming operations, as well as their expectations for the future. On top of that, this is the weakest farmer sentiment reading in more than a year, back when the index stood at 118 in July of 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic's first wave. The economic data in this report covers several areas, but one sector that farmers were particularly bullish on were land values, which they're expecting to rise. How would you feel if your alma mater invited an activist to campus to speak against everything that is moving your industry forward? You'd be unhappy about it, to say the very least. Well, that's exactly the kind of response that the University of Missouri, Kansas City has been getting. The public university paid Dr. Vandana Shiva, one of the world's leading opponents of modern agricultural practices and biotechnology, tens of thousands of dollars to come to a speaking engagement Thursday evening. Her invitation was so offensive that a letter was signed by a group of international scholars and journalists, including at least one Nobel laureate, protesting her appearance. The school was criticized for providing a platform to someone who has knowingly misrepresented scientific evidence and has maligned food and farming in her personal war against multinational corporations. While academia has an obligation to challenge scientific findings and give a voice to reasonable opposition, having Shiva speak to students is akin to having a Holocaust denier or a flat earther at the podium. and the schools taking no apparent steps to foster any deeper discussions, to correct or to flesh out any of the misinformation that Shiva is saying. Well, that wraps up a whirlwind 7 days in the agricultural industry. But there's so much more on the horizon, including the National FFA Convention happening later this month, which will be in person for the first time in 2 years. We're excited to see that. We're going to be there, and please keep an eye on agdaily.com and on all of our social channels to stay up to date on everything that's happening in agriculture.